The hall falls silent. The hall was filled with the restless hum of voices, the quiet shuffle of feet, and the soft glow of camera lights. Hundreds of people had gathered, leaders, journalists, students, and innovators, each waiting for the next moment in an event that was already historic. The Prime Minister of India, Modi ji, had been moving across the stage, shaking hands, exchanging words of encouragement with young minds and experienced professionals alike. But then, something unexpected happened. His steps slowed, and instead of continuing toward the center of the stage, he turned his body and began walking directly toward a woman seated quietly in the second row. At first, no one noticed. The hall was still buzzing with conversation, but then one by one eyes began to follow his movements. Whispers spread like ripples across water. Why was he walking toward her? Who was she? The cameras quickly shifted, lenses adjusting to capture the Prime Minister's sudden change in direction. As he approached, people recognized the woman. She was Sundar Pichai's mother, dressed simply, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes calm but filled with quiet pride. The silence grew heavier. The hall seemed to hold its breath. Sundar himself, standing at the edge of the stage, turned toward his mother with surprise. He had been honored countless times before, but this moment felt different. Something deep inside him stirred, as though years of memories and sacrifices had all collapsed into this single moment. To the audience, it looked like a small gesture, the leader of the nation walking toward a mother. But to Sundar, it was as if the entire weight of his past was rushing back. In that instant, he was no longer the CEO of Google, no longer the man in the spotlight. He was once again the young boy sitting beside his mother in a modest home in Chennai, listening to her gentle voice as she told him stories of resilience, kindness, and humility. The Prime Minister's steps echoed in Sundar's mind like a drumbeat. Each one pulled him deeper into his memories. Sundar's childhood home was small, barely enough for the family, with thin walls and a roof that leaked when the rains grew heavy. Yet inside that home there was warmth, laughter, and a sense of togetherness that no storm could wash away. His father, a hard-working engineer, and his mother, a woman of quiet strength, raised their sons with more love than money could ever provide. Every evening, Sundar would sit near the radio, fascinated by the voices and sounds that traveled across invisible waves to reach their little home. He did not know it then, but those moments would spark a curiosity that would one day change the world. His mother would smile as she watched him listen intently, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. She could sense that his mind was different, that he saw the world not just as it was, but as it could be. School was not easy. Sundar walked long distances under the scorching sun, sometimes carrying only a small notebook because the family could not afford much. He wore the same pair of shoes until they were worn thin, and when the soles finally gave out, his mother stitched them as best she could, reminding him that strength was not about what one had, but about how one used it. At night, when the power cut out, the family would light a small lamp. Sundar's mother would sit beside him as he studied, her voice soft but firm, telling him that no matter how hard life seemed, knowledge would always be his true light. She often skipped her own comforts, sacrificing new clothes or jewelry, saving every rupee for her children's education. Neighbors sometimes whispered that the family was too ambitious, that sending their son to the best schools was a dream, too big for their modest means. But Sundar's mother never listened. Her faith in him was unshakable, and her belief became the foundation on which he built his dreams. Back in the hall, as Modi ji drew closer to her seat, Sundar could feel those memories pressing against his heart. He remembered the nights when his mother stayed awake, worrying about how to pay the next school fee. He remembered her soft prayers whispered when he left for exams. He remembered the quiet tears she thought no one saw when sacrifices became too heavy. But she carried them anyway. The journalists raised their cameras higher, eager to capture the moment. Students in the crowd leaned forward, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. The entire hall, once filled with scattered voices and restless energy, had now fallen into absolute stillness. Sundar's eyes locked with his mother's. She looked the same as always, calm, humble, almost unaware of the magnitude of the moment. He knew she had never cared for the spotlight. She did not want recognition, she wanted goodness. She wanted him to remember where he came from, no matter how far he went. And now, the most powerful man in the country was walking directly toward her. Sundar's heart raced. He thought back to his younger years, the day he received news of being admitted to Stanford. The joy on his father's face, the tears in his mother's eyes, the silence that followed when they realized how expensive it would be. Yet his parents did not hesitate. They gave everything they could, even when it meant living with less because they wanted their son to see the world beyond the walls of their small home. In those days, Sundar had felt guilt as much as gratitude. He worried that their sacrifices might be too great. He wondered if he would ever be able to repay them. But his mother always told him, "We are not giving you a burden, Sundar. We are giving you wings. One day you will fly higher than you can imagine." And now, standing on that stage with the world watching, he realized those words had come true. The Prime Minister finally reached her row. Every eye in the hall followed his movement. And then, something no one expected happened. Instead of simply greeting her with a handshake or a polite nod, Modi ji stopped in front of her, folded his hands, and bowed his head slightly in respect. The hall gasped. Flashes from cameras lit up the moment, but the silence was even louder than the noise. Sundar's mother looked surprised, almost shy. She slowly returned the gesture, her hands trembling slightly. Tears welled in Sundar's eyes. In that moment, he was not thinking about Google, about technology, or about success. He was thinking about his mother, about the woman who had given everything without ever asking for recognition. And now, the nation itself was honoring her. The hall remained silent, but Sundar's heart was thunder. What happened next would not only stun the entire audience, but would also reveal a truth about respect, humility, and the unseen strength of mothers that no one was prepared for. Roots and resilience. As the hall watched in stunned silence, Sundar's mind drifted further back, deeper into the story that few truly knew. Behind every moment of glory, there were years of unseen struggle. Behind every smile of success, there were countless tears shed in silence. People often looked at him and saw only the CEO, the innovator, the global leader. But in truth, he was still the boy who grew up in a modest neighborhood of Chennai, where every day was a test of patience, sacrifice, and resilience. His house had only 2 rooms, and in those rooms, the family shared not only space but also dreams. His father worked tirelessly as an engineer for a company that made electrical components. His mother, once a stenographer, gave up her own career so she could devote her time to raising her children. Every decision they made carried weight, for there was never enough money to be careless. Yet despite the struggles, there was never a shortage of love. The walls of the house were plain, the furniture simple, but Sundar remembered it as the place where his imagination was born. He would sit by the window, listening to the distant sounds of bicycles, vendors, and children playing cricket in the street. The smell of spices from neighbors' kitchens would drift in, mixing with the scent of the notebooks and pencils he carried everywhere. He was curious about everything. Why radios worked, why telephones carried voices, why machines moved the way they did. But curiosity alone could not feed ambition. School was a challenge, not just because of the subjects, but because of the distance and the conditions. Sundar would walk several kilometers under the scorching sun, sometimes with little in his bag but determination. The heat was unforgiving. The dust clung to his clothes, and yet he walked day after day, never complaining. His mother would pack him a small tiffin, often simple food, but she always placed it in his hands with love, as if it were a feast. Teachers noticed his brilliance early. They saw how quickly he grasped concepts, how his eyes lit up whenever new ideas were introduced. But brilliance alone was not enough in a world that measured potential by resources. Other children had private tutors, better books, and access to things Sundar could only dream of. Many times he felt the weight of that difference pressing against him, a silent reminder that life was not fair, but instead of breaking him, it sharpened his resolve. Still, there were days when doubt crept in. He would return home exhausted, his shoes torn, his shirt damp with sweat, and he would wonder if it was worth it. He would wonder if the sacrifices his parents were making could ever lead to something greater. And each time his mother would look into his eyes and speak words that steadied him. She would say, "Sundar, we cannot always choose our starting point, but we can choose how far we go." Those words stayed with him, shaping his spirit like iron forged in fire. The evenings in their home carried their own quiet rhythm. When electricity failed, as it often did, the family lit small lamps and continued with whatever they could. Sundar would study under that dim light, his father reading the newspaper. Beside him, his mother preparing meals with the little they had. There was a kind of discipline in that simplicity, a reminder that progress was not born from comfort, but from perseverance. Neighbors sometimes laughed at the family's sacrifices. They would say things like, "Why push him so hard? Why dream so big when you can live quietly?" But Sundar's parents did not listen. They knew that education was not just about knowledge. It was about dignity, about lifting oneself from the limitations of circumstance. Sundar's mother often told him stories of great leaders, people who had started with nothing but faith and determination. She wanted him to see that greatness was not reserved for the wealthy but for the resilient. One memory stood out sharply in Sundar's mind. It was the day he first touched a rotary phone. His father had brought one home for work. Sundar turned the dial slowly, fascinated by the sound it made as it spun back into place. He asked question after question, unable to stop his curiosity. His mother watched him with a smile, her heart swelling with pride. In that moment, she knew his mind would carry him far, even if the road was hard. And the road was indeed hard. Financial struggles never seemed to end. Every new school year came with the burden of fees, uniforms, and books. Often, the family had to make choices. Less food on the table, fewer clothes, more sacrifices, so that Sundar could continue his education. His mother wore the same saris year after year, her bangles chipped and faded, but she never once complained. Instead, she wore her sacrifices like invisible medals of honor. As Sundar grew older, the challenges grew heavier. The competition in school intensified. Many times he faced students who had more opportunities, better preparation, and greater confidence. Failure knocked at his door more than once, and each time he felt the sting of disappointment. But each time, his mother reminded him that resilience was not about never falling. It was about rising again and again, stronger each time. When he won small prizes, in math competitions or science fairs, she celebrated them as though they were national victories. When he failed, she reminded him that failure was simply another form of learning. Her words carried a power that books could not provide. And then came a moment that changed everything. One ordinary evening, as the family sat together in their modest home, a letter arrived. The envelope was thin, the paper crisp. His father handed it to him with a serious expression, and his mother's hands trembled as Sundar carefully opened it. The letter was from a prestigious institution, one that could shape his future in ways they had only dreamed about. The room was silent as his eyes moved across the words. His breath caught. His heart pounded. The letter was an acceptance, a chance to step into a new world, a world far beyond the narrow streets of his neighborhood. His mother gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand. Tears filled her eyes, but beneath them was pride, fierce and unshakable. She looked at him as though he were no longer just her son, but the embodiment of every sacrifice, every prayer, every moment of struggle they had endured. But then the silence shifted. The joy of acceptance was quickly shadowed by another truth. The cost, the tuition, the travel, the living expenses. The numbers on the paper were overwhelming, far beyond what the family could afford. The dream was within reach, yet just as quickly, it seemed to slip away. The hall came back into focus for Sundar. Modi ji was still standing before his mother, the moment stretching like eternity. Sundar blinked, his heart heavy with the memory of that letter, the choice that had once threatened to crush his dreams before they even began. The audience in the hall remained silent, waiting, unaware of the storm that raged inside him. Sundar knew that if not for his mother's resilience, that letter could have been the end of his story, not the beginning. But what had happened next, the decision his parents made, the sacrifices that followed, those were the things that truly stunned him, even more than the recognition he now received from the world. What came after that letter would test not only his courage, but also the strength of his family's love. The fire of dreams, the letter lay on the table like a spark, waiting to become a fire. It was the kind of letter that could change a life forever. Sundar had been accepted to one of the most prestigious universities in the world, Stanford. For a boy who had grown up in the narrow streets of Chennai, walking miles under the hot sun to school, it felt like the door to another universe had suddenly opened. But with that door came a shadow. The tuition, the living expenses, the cost of travel. They were numbers that dwarfed anything his family had ever imagined. His mother sat in silence, staring at the letter as though it were both a miracle and a burden. His father, normally a man of quiet strength, looked down at his hands, calculating, worrying, searching for a way. Sundar's heart pounded as he watched them. He should have been celebrating, but instead he felt guilt pressing against him. He knew how hard they had worked for every rupee, how many sacrifices they had already made just to keep him in school. Could he really ask for more? But his mother broke the silence first. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. She said, "Sundar, this is not a letter. This is a bridge. It is our chance to see you cross into a world we only dreamed about. We will find a way. Do not doubt that." Her words burned into him like fire. It was not just hope. It was a promise. She would make sure he walked through that door no matter the cost. And so began one of the hardest seasons of their lives. His father borrowed money from friends, relatives, anyone who could lend. He sold small pieces of jewelry and savings that had been carefully kept for years. His mother let go of even more of her comforts, each sacrifice invisible to the world, but immense to the family. They stitched together enough to send him across the ocean to a country they had never seen, for a future they could only imagine. The day of his departure arrived sooner than he was ready for. The railway station was crowded, noisy, filled with the smell of chai and coal smoke. His parents stood on the platform holding back tears. His mother handed him a small steel container filled with food she had prepared, as though the taste of home could protect him on the long journey ahead. Sundar hugged them tightly. He felt his father's strong hand on his shoulder, and his mother's soft fingers lingering on his face as though she was memorizing him. She whispered, "No matter where you go, remember who you are and remember who we are." And then, the train pulled away, carrying him toward an airplane, carrying him toward a new life. He leaned against the window, watching his parents shrink into the distance, his chest heavy with both excitement and grief. When he arrived in America, the world seemed overwhelming. The streets were wide, the buildings taller than anything he had ever seen, the technology far ahead of what he had known. He felt like a small drop in an endless ocean. At Stanford, the classrooms were filled with brilliant minds from across the globe. Students discussed ideas with confidence, while Sundar often stayed quiet, still finding his voice in a language that was not his own. Money was tight. He counted every dollar, every cent. Textbooks were expensive, meals were simple, and even the thought of calling home was weighed against the cost of international phone minutes. He often walked instead of taking buses, just as he had in India, carrying not only his books but also the invisible weight of his family's sacrifices. Loneliness was the hardest part. In the evenings, when the campus quieted down, he would sit alone in his dorm room staring at the walls. The smell of the food was strange, the voices around him unfamiliar, and for the first time, he felt truly far from home. He missed his mother's gentle touch, his father's steady presence, the comfort of their modest home. Sometimes the silence was so heavy it pressed against his chest, making it hard to breathe. There was a moment, one cold night, when the pressure nearly broke him. He had just finished a long day of classes, and he returned to his room to find a small letter from the university regarding upcoming fees. The numbers blurred in his vision. He felt his hands shaking, his heart sinking. He sat on the floor, his back against the bed, and for the first time in years he thought about giving up. Maybe this dream was too big. Maybe he was asking too much of his parents. Maybe it was better to return home and stop the burden before it crushed them all. He closed his eyes, and in the quiet of that room he heard his mother's voice. Not in reality, but in memory. She was saying, "We are not giving you a burden, Sundar. We are giving you wings." Those words wrapped around him like a shield. And then, as if the universe itself had been listening, the phone in the hallway rang. It was late and he almost ignored it, but something pushed him to answer. He picked up the receiver and on the other end was the voice of his father. The connection was weak, the line crackling, but the voice was steady. His father said, "Sundar, we are proud of you. Don't ever doubt that. Do your work, focus, and everything else will follow. We will manage here. Just keep going." Sundar felt tears running down his face. He had been so close to giving up, and yet here was his father, across thousands of miles, reminding him that he was not alone. His mother's soft voice came through faintly in the background, saying, "Study well, eat well, don't worry about us." He clutched the receiver tightly as though he could hold him across the distance. That phone call became his anchor. He realized then that he was not carrying the weight of their sacrifices alone. They were carrying it together. From that moment, something changed in him. He began to see every challenge as a test, not a defeat. He worked harder, studied longer, pushed himself further. When loneliness struck, he reminded himself of his mother's words. When fear tried to pull him down, he remembered the fire in his father's voice. But success did not come quickly. There were still rejections, still setbacks. Professors challenged him, peers outshined him, and opportunities slipped through his fingers. Yet with every stumble, he rose again. Each failure was fuel for the fire of dreams that burned within him. And then came a day when everything would change again. A day when he received an unexpected message, a chance that would alter the course of his journey. It was not from his parents nor from a professor, but from a company that would one day become his destiny. The climb inside Google, the years at Stanford, tested Sundar in ways he had never expected. But they also sharpened his vision and prepared him for something far greater. After completing his studies, he began working in the technology field, quietly building a reputation as a man who combined sharp intelligence with a gentle presence. He was not loud. He did not command rooms with sheer force of personality, but those who worked with him sensed a steady strength in the way he listened, in the way he thought before speaking, in the way he noticed details others overlooked. When the opportunity came to interview at Google, Sundar felt the same mix of hope and doubt that had followed him since his days in Chennai. Google at that time was already becoming one of the most exciting companies in the world, filled with some of the brightest minds in technology. The idea of stepping into that world both thrilled and terrified him. He remembered walking into the campus for the first time, seeing the colorful buildings, the bicycles scattered around, the energy of people who seemed to be racing toward the future with every step they took. His interviews were intense. Questions came rapid fire, designed not only to test his technical knowledge but also to measure how he thought under pressure. Sundar remained calm. He did not rush, did not try to impress with flashy words. He approached each problem as he always had, with patience, clarity, and humility. When he did not know something, he admitted it honestly but showed how he would find the answer. In a world where many tried to appear perfect, his quiet honesty stood out. A few weeks later, he received the call. He had been offered the job. It was a moment that felt like another bridge had appeared before him, just as his mother had once described. But this bridge led not only to a job, but to a future that would change the direction of his life forever. Joining Google was like stepping into a storm of ideas. The company thrived on innovation and the air was thick with competition. Brilliant engineers argued passionately in meetings, voices rising as they fought for their ideas. Projects moved quickly, deadlines pressed heavily, and failure could mean being forgotten in the shadows of those who succeeded. For Sundar, it was overwhelming at first. He was surrounded by people who spoke with confidence, who seemed certain of their place in the company, while he often felt like an outsider. He sat in meetings, listening, observing, his notebook filling with notes while others filled the room with their voices. Sometimes he wondered if he was too quiet for this place, too humble for a world that seemed to reward loudness. Yet he remembered what his mother had told him long ago. Strength is not always in speaking the loudest, but in speaking with truth. So he stayed patient. He worked harder than anyone, studied every project with care, and built his understanding piece by piece. Colleagues began to notice that when Sundar did speak, his words carried weight. He had a way of cutting through the noise, of finding clarity where others got lost in complexity. One of the first projects that tested him deeply was related to the Google toolbar. At the time, the toolbar was a small feature, not seen as glamorous compared to larger projects. But Sundar saw its potential. He noticed how users interacted with it, how it connected people to Google, even when they were not on the search page. While others dismissed it as unimportant, Sundar quietly dedicated himself to improving it, refining it, and showing its value. His work did not go unnoticed. Senior leaders began to see his ability to spot opportunities where others saw only small details, but even then, Sundar's path was not smooth. There were moments when his ideas were questioned, moments when louder voices tried to overshadow him. In one particular meeting, a heated debate broke out about the future of Google's products. Senior engineers argued fiercely, each convinced their vision was the right one. Sundar sat quietly, listening, his heart racing. He knew he had an idea that could shift the conversation, but doubt gnawed at him. Should he speak? Would anyone even listen? He thought back to his father's words during that crackling phone call across continents. Do your work, focus, and everything else will follow. He realized this was his moment. When he finally raised his voice, the room fell silent. He spoke clearly without force, laying out his vision of how the company could move forward. He explained not only the technical details but also the human side, how users would feel, how their lives would be impacted, how the smallest changes could make the greatest difference. His words were not loud, but they carried an undeniable weight. When he finished, there was a long pause. Then, to his surprise, heads began to nod. The debate cooled. The room shifted. For the first time, Sundar felt the power of his own voice in that world. He realized he did not need to be the loudest. He only needed to be the truest. After that day, people looked at him differently. Colleagues sought his opinion. Leaders noticed his clarity. He was no longer just the quiet engineer in the corner. He was becoming someone whose perspective could shape the company's future. But success in such a place was never without obstacles. As his influence grew, so did the pressure. New projects came his way, bigger responsibilities, higher expectations, and with them came the silent resistance of those who envied his rise. In the shadows of progress, there were always whispers, doubts, and challenges waiting to pull him down. Sundar faced setbacks too. Not every idea was accepted. Not every project succeeded. There were failures that stung, moments when he felt he had let his team down, nights when he returned home carrying the weight of disappointment. But each time he remembered the resilience that had carried him from Chennai to Stanford. He remembered the sacrifices of his parents, the faith of his mother, the fire of his dreams, and so he kept moving forward step by step, quietly climbing in a world that valued speed and noise. Then came a day that would test him like never before. The company was preparing for a major launch, one that could shape its future. The pressure was immense. Teams worked day and night. Tension ran high and mistakes could be devastating. Sundar found himself at the center of it all, leading efforts that many doubted he was ready for. The launch date drew closer and problems piled up. Critical decisions needed to be made. People looked at him, some with trust, others with doubt. He could feel the weight of their expectations pressing against him, heavier than anything he had faced before. In that moment, Sundar thought again of his mother's voice, the one that had always steadied him. Strength is not about what you have, but about what you give. He realized that leadership was not about power, but about service. He stood before his team, not as a boss demanding results, but as a guide offering direction, humility, and encouragement. And when the launch finally happened, the world watched in awe. It was not perfect, but it was powerful. It showed the vision he had carried, the clarity he had fought for, and the resilience that had become his greatest strength. The CEO of Google himself noticed him that day, and with that notice came a shift that would alter Sundar's life forever. recognition and respect after the launch that caught the CEO's attention, Sundar's path inside Google began to shift. The quiet engineer who once blended into the background was now being asked to lead larger teams, manage bigger projects, and present directly to the highest levels of leadership. It was both exhilarating and frightening. Sundar had never craved power, but he understood that responsibility was not something to run from. It was something to carry with humility. In meetings, more eyes turned toward him. Colleagues who once dismissed him now listened carefully when he spoke. Leaders who barely knew his name began asking for his opinion. But with recognition came a subtle change in the atmosphere around him. Whispers grew louder in the hallways. Not everyone welcomed his rise. Some colleagues, driven by ambition and pride, began to view him not as a teammate, but as a rival. Sundar could feel the sharpness, in their words, the quiet resistance in their gestures. It would have been easy for him to fight back, to raise his own voice and protect his place. But instead, Sundar leaned on the same qualities that had carried him through every hardship of his life: patience, humility, and resilience. He did not waste energy on envy or pride. He focused on his work, on serving the users who depended on Google's products, and on supporting the teams who trusted him. His strength came not from pushing others down, but from lifting the vision higher. Yet, success in Silicon Valley carried a cost that even Sundar had not anticipated. The long nights, the endless travel, the constant stream of decisions pulled him away from the people who mattered most: his family. He had a wife and young children by then, and though they gave him joy and grounding, he often worried that his work was stealing moments he could never reclaim. There were nights when his children asked if he would be home for dinner, and though he promised, the demands of his role often broke that promise. In the quiet of those nights, when the world, outside his window, slept, Sundar felt a familiar heaviness. He thought of his own parents, how they had given everything for him, and he wondered if he was now failing to give the same to his own children. Success felt glorious on stage, in meetings, in news headlines, but in the silence of home, success often felt incomplete. It was during one of those heavy seasons that his mother came to visit him in America. She had aged since those early days in Chennai, her hair streaked with silver, her movements slower, but her eyes carried the same calm, strength. When she stepped into his home, she seemed almost overwhelmed by the world her son now lived in. The spacious house, the technology everywhere, the life far removed from the small two-room home where it had all begun. For Sundar, her presence was like a light cutting through the fog. She walked through the house with gentle curiosity, touching objects carefully, asking small questions, smiling softly. When she sat with her grandchildren, her laughter filled the room in a way no achievement could. Sundar watched her and realized something powerful. No matter how far he had come, no matter how much he had achieved, he was still the boy who needed his mother's grounding presence. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, his mother looked at him quietly and said, "You look tired, Sundar. Your shoulders are heavy." He tried to laugh it off, but she pressed on. "Do not forget that success is not only about what the world sees. It is about how much peace you carry inside." Those words sank deep into him. He realized she was right. He had been chasing goals, carrying burdens, fighting battles, but somewhere along the way, he had begun to lose sight of the balance that truly mattered. His mother's presence reminded him that greatness was not only about building products or leading teams. It was about remaining kind, humble, and connected to the people who mattered most. Soon after, Sundar faced one of the greatest challenges of his career. A major product launch was approaching, one that could define Google's direction for years. The entire company was watching, investors were waiting, competitors were circling, and the pressure on his shoulders was immense. Teams worked tirelessly, but with every day that passed, problems grew. Technical issues threatened delays, and rumors of failure began to spread. The whispers of doubt grew louder. Some questioned whether Sundar was the right person to lead. Others quietly hoped he would stumble. The pressure mounted to a level that felt unbearable. There were nights when he sat alone in his office, staring at the glowing screens, wondering if he could carry the weight. But then he would remember his mother's words. Strength is not about what you have, but about what you give. He realized his role was not to prove himself, but to guide others, to serve the vision, to remain steady when everyone else was shaken. So he gathered his team. He spoke to them not as a commander barking orders, but as a friend reminding them of why they began this journey. He reminded them that the product was not just code and design. It was something that would touch millions of lives, something that could make people's lives simpler, easier, kinder. His words steadied the team, and together they pushed forward, solving problems one by one. The launch day arrived. The world watched. Competitors waited for failure. Inside Google, hearts raced as the countdown began. Sundar stood quietly, his face calm, though his heart thundered inside his chest. When the product finally went live, the first moments were tense. Small glitches appeared, but the system held. Minutes turned into hours, and the product began to flow smoothly into the hands of users across the world. And then, something extraordinary happened. The reviews began pouring in, the feedback glowing. Users loved it. Journalists praised it. The launch that had seemed doomed to fail had instead become a triumph. Inside Google, the atmosphere shifted from tension to celebration. Teams cheered, leaders smiled, and for a brief moment the entire company seemed to breathe as one. At the center of it all stood Sundar. He did not raise his arms in victory. He did not boast or demand recognition. Instead, he quietly thanked his team, giving them the spotlight they deserved. But those who were watching closely, the leaders, the CEO, saw something else. They saw a man who could carry storms with humility, a man who could turn fear into focus, doubt into direction. That night, when Sundar returned home, his mother was waiting. She looked at him, saw the calm in his eyes, and smiled softly. "This is what I meant," she said. "Peace comes when you remember who you are, not when the world tells you who you are." A few weeks later, an unexpected letter arrived at his desk. It was not from within Google, not from a colleague or a leader. It was an invitation, one that reached across oceans, pulling him back toward the land where it had all begun. India was calling him home, not just as a son, but as a leader recognized by the nation itself. Sundar held the letter in his hands, and his heart began to race. He had stood on stages before, spoken to countless audiences, led teams that shaped the future of technology. But this invitation was different. This was not just about him. This was about his parents, about his roots, about the sacrifices that had carried him this far. And he could not yet know that this invitation would lead to the moment where the entire hall would fall silent, the moment when Modi ji would walk toward his mother, the moment that would stun not just him, but the entire world. The hall and the silence, the invitation from India felt like more than a piece of paper. It felt like destiny calling, a thread pulling Sundar back to the place where it had all begun. As he boarded the flight, he stared out the window at the endless clouds, his mind filled with memories. He thought of the narrow streets of Chennai, the two-room house, the dim lamplight where he had studied late into the night. He thought of his father's steady hands and his mother's quiet sacrifices. He thought of the moments when he almost gave up, and the voices that had carried him through. India welcomed him not just as a man, but as a symbol. News of his visit spread quickly. People spoke of him with pride, not only as the CEO of Google, but as a son of the soil who had carried the name of India across the world. Journalists prepared their cameras, leaders arranged their schedules, students lined up to hear him speak. For Sundar, it was overwhelming. He had never sought fame, but now it surrounded him. Yet through it all, he carried himself as he always had, with humility, with quiet dignity, with the calm strength of someone who had not forgotten his roots. And then came the day of the grand event. The hall was immense, filled with leaders, innovators, students, and journalists. Bright lights illuminated the stage, and the air was heavy with anticipation. Sundar stood near the edge of the stage, his heart steady but his mind restless. He had spoken in countless auditoriums before, but this was different. This was home. This was India. This was where his journey had begun, and where the full circle would close. The event began with speeches, with words of welcome, with applause that seemed to shake the walls. Sundar listened quietly, his gaze often drifting to the second row where his mother sat. She was dressed simply, just as she had always been, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes calm but glowing with pride. To the rest of the hall, she was just a guest. But to Sundar, she was the very reason he was standing there at all. Then, as the event continued, Modi ji rose from his seat. The hall grew louder at first, applause echoing as people assumed he was moving toward the podium. But then his steps slowed, and instead of heading for the stage, he turned. The applause softened into confusion. Whispers spread, and slowly, silence began to fall like a wave sweeping across the hall. Sundar's eyes widened as he realized where the Prime Minister was walking. Toward her. Toward his mother. Every step Modi ji took felt like thunder in Sundar's heart. He watched, frozen, as the leader of the nation moved past rows of dignitaries, past the cameras, past the lights, until he stood directly before his mother. The hall was silent now. The air was so still that it felt as though time itself had stopped. Thousands of people leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the simple woman in the second row. And then, Modi ji folded his hands and bowed his head. The entire hall gasped. It was not just respect. It was reverence. It was an acknowledgement, not of power or position, but of sacrifice, of motherhood, of the unseen strength that had carried Sundar from the dust of Chennai to the heights of Silicon Valley.